Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosophers before me. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but D. Nameland didn't die of corona, which actually is connected to the topic of this video. I mean, when everyone is concerned with the bug, so to speak, let's talk about something related to that. That's what I would propose. Which kind of reminds me of these, you know, stupid Hollywood trailers where you have something like, in a world where everyone is concerned with corona. Oh no, we're all gonna die. Where's my toilet paper, you mother? The only thing left to do is to watch Eugene the Philosopher's video. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher. On YouTube, worldwide, on screens, since May, 17th, maybe, something like that. So this was the trailer for this video, essentially. So yeah, we're going to be talking about life and its possible impact on certain geophysical processes, let's put it in those vague terms. So there is a paper in particular which I would like to discuss, which I have here with me, which is called Possible Tectonic Impact of Biosphere. It was written by a guy named, although maybe it's, I don't know, I should be careful here about assuming their gender. I mean, maybe they are a masculine presenting trans lesbian or something like that. I mean, today you never know. E.th.ph, probably one of those, you know, silly, toxic Slavic types. Okay, so what are they proposing in this paper? The author proposes in the paper, I repeat, which is called Possible Tectonic Impact of Biosphere. I'll put the link into the description. And by the way, there were at least 4 videos discussing this paper previously. And if you've watched them, you pretty much already know what I'm going to tell you. And especially if you've already read the paper itself, then definitely this video would probably add very little to your understanding and like whatever, but you may still watch it. Nobody was going to watch it anyway. So what's this paper is going to tell us? And I'll propose to use the same technique I've already elucidated in my video, Two Faces of Scientific Communication, where I've said that the first thing you should read, well, obviously after the title, is the abstract. Then the second thing you need to read is the conclusions. And then you need to read the body of the paper if you really want to know the details, right? So let's read the abstract. This would sound very silly, like I don't like reading from the paper, but this is what I'm kind of forced to do in this case. So let's do this together. So the abstract goes as this paper explores the possibility of existence of ultra-deep biosphere, in parentheses, deeper than 10 kilometers under the surface, parentheses closed, and the biogenic earthquake hypothesis, the idea that subsurface microorganisms might be directly related to earthquake activity. The importance of electroautotrophic type of metabolism is underlined, and the role of telluric currents in this process is explored in some detail, as well as the role of subsurface and atmospheric microorganisms in the global electric circuit. It seems that the existing estimates of the adaptability of biological organisms are inconsistent with empirical evidence, and theoretical concepts predict key biochemical processes to fail long before the onset of the temperatures and pressures at which microorganisms are actually observed. This implies that life might exist much deeper beneath the surface than previously assumed. At the same time, the estimates of energy radiated during the strongest earthquakes are consistent with the biochemical energy available to the subsurface biosphere. Some additional evidence is examined. It is proposed that the ultra-deep biosphere might represent an important factor in resolving the debate on the nature of hydrocarbons. At the same time, the deep subsurface microorganisms might play a significant evolutionary role, not only providing seismically induced genetic variation and a seed bank for quick recovery after a mass extinction, but also by modulating longer climatic cycles through planetary-wide biogeoelectrochemistry. Okay, so this already represents like quite a bunch of ideas, and believe me, like if you read the paper, there's many more ideas, and only like maybe, I don't know, 10% of those would be covered in this video. So I highly recommend you to read it, because it's quite amusing, although it's written in sort of quite a dry-ish language. So let's go to the conclusions, because that kind of sounds interesting, right? All right, you go out. So the conclusions say on page 24, the primary idea of this research, okay, I'll just kind of read it for myself and just repeat it, because it would be silly to read the whole page. So the primary idea is that microorganisms might be related to production of seismic signals, which we detect with our seismometers and whatever. And logically, this hypothesis rests on two statements, which is one, that microorganisms might exist deeper below the surface than we previously assumed. This is the first idea. And the second idea, that these super deep microorganisms, or maybe macroorganisms, who knows, but the paper says micro, might play a role in earthquake production. So this is sort of like this is my comment as Eugene the philosopher, this is sort of an yet unexplored possibility, I believe. Like, it also kind of reminds you about all those horrible subterranean creatures of Lovecraft. Again, see my video about Lovecraft, Layers of Lovecraft, it's called. But, well, it's a possibility that is explored in this particular paper, right? So, further, the conclusions say that the section 2 formulates the hypothesis explicitly, this biogenic earthquake hypothesis, and provides some initial analysis that, let's say, microorganisms might play a role of a source of energy in the first place for the earthquake, because again, as we've seen in the abstract, there's enough energy, biochemical energy anyways. Maybe there are some other forms of energy, like the force, you know, or whatever. So this is one possibility, that they act as a source of energy, but another possibility is that they may act as only a trigger. So the energy is stored and collected in by some other non-biogenic processes, whereas the biosphere, this subterranean collective, acts only as a trigger which releases this energy at some particular time, right? So yeah, in section 3, a detailed analysis of the hypothesis is given. In particular, it is discussed there in section 3 what are the possibilities for delivering this energy in situ. Like, how can we focus this energy in a particular point? And by the way, like the epicenter, you know, or the focus actually of the earthquake, because, well, the focus of the earthquake is where the earthquake actually occurs, whereas the epicenter is the projection of this point of the focus on the surface, right? Because the focus is obviously beneath the ground. So, yeah. And it is assumed, or it is, let's say, noted there, that fault lines actually correspond to the places where most of the earthquakes occur. And in particular, it's very obvious in the so-called Ring of Fire around the Pacific, where like 90% of all the earthquakes occur. But you see, the Ring of Fire, essentially what it is the subduction zones, as they call it. So there are like these sort of wedges. So it's like a deep, I don't know how you call it, crack, I guess, in the earth, and earthquakes occur somewhere in this crack. So the idea there is that, well, these cracks would represent the most accessible points for microorganisms into the depths of the crust, right? So it would be logical that most of earthquakes would occur there, all right? So what the author says is that they've also shown that again, the microorganisms might tolerate much more extreme conditions than has been assumed previously, etc. And the limits of life to exist in the first place are seriously underestimated. And again, I've talked about that quite a bit in my videos, Onion of Aliens, 3 parts, where I've discussed how life may exist, well, more or less anywhere. If you consider different possibilities for energy acquisition, element acquisition, like gathering of material, you know, you can exist in interstellar space easily because there's plenty of energy and plenty of various elements and even complex molecules out there. So yeah. So yeah, there are many possibilities for nutrient and energy production in the mantle, in particular, in the crust, and there are many processes, in particular electrolitho-autotropic type of metabolism, which allows you to recycle, let's say, mantle minerals or deep crust minerals and get energy and get all the necessary elements, or at least all the key elements for life, such as oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, etc., etc. There's plenty of all of that in the depths of the earth, right? But the interesting thing is, again, that telluric currents, that is the currents that run through the earth itself, through the crust, or even deeper, we don't really know actually, may play a significant role in this whole process, both in the process of acquisition of energy by these organisms, hypothetical organisms, and in the process of, let's say, producing an earthquake by these organisms, whatever they are, if they exist in the first place. So the author says that perhaps this ultra-deep biosphere actually represents a previously unrecognized source of telluric currents, which is also an interesting idea, that maybe these organisms actually, well, it's kind of a vague analogy and it's not given in the paper, it's sort of my comment on it. It's like maybe they represent like sort of a neural network, a network of neurons, or a very vague analogy. And as you know, neurons exchange electric signals, right? So maybe this hypothetical subterranean network of organisms might also do something like that. So yeah, and that would be another source of telluric currents. And obviously currents emit some sort of radiation. It might be ultra low frequency radio waves, for example, which are, as we know, correlated with seismic activity, etc. So it's an interesting idea, I suppose. So in section 4, some of the other evidence has been examined, namely the emission of methane from fault lines. Like, there's quite a bit of papers describing that, quite a bit of research on that part, that during and after, and maybe even before the earthquake, there's quite a noticeable emission of methane around the epicenter of the earthquake. And then the widespread presence of bacteria in shale oil and gas. Again, this fracking thing is discussed in a bit of detail in this paper. And yeah, so, and even like the earthquake activity related to fracking is actually more pronounced, and again, there are some references to that given in the paper, when not just the fracking itself occurs, which is basically you pump the liquid to make some cracks in the, how do you call it, well, oil-bearing rock, let's call it that. So that's the first part of the process. Then you basically pump the oil out, and then you have a lot of this waste water that you've pumped initially, and you have to somehow get rid of it. So people just drill wells, deep wells, nearby of those sites where fracking occurred and just pump the water in them. So it is assumed currently that this is actually the main source of fracking-induced quakes. So in places like Oklahoma, for example, or in Canada, or in Europe even, and maybe in Asia. I'm not sure if they're doing fracking there. Probably they do, especially in China, I would assume. But anyway, this is the main source of fracking-related quakes, this wastewater injection. And wastewater is basically a salt water with some weird mix of chemicals on top of it. So that would be understandable if this water would kind of, enhance the activity of whatever microorganisms are present there. So this is what it is talked about here. Right. Okay. So another piece of evidence, so to speak, is the frequent observation of unique microorganisms in volcanic eruptions and volcanic and fresh lava. Like, it is assumed that the organisms in lava actually arrive there because, well, the microorganisms, as it is assumed, cannot survive in lava. But again, as the observations show, it's some unique type of microorganisms usually. So maybe they can survive, and maybe they actually erupted with the lava rather than, arrived to the lava from external sources afterwards, after the eruption. So, and then another very related to our modern situation topic that is discussed is the post-earthquake pathogen spreading. And so the hypothesis that is given in this paper, one of hundreds of hypotheses, is that those infections actually may be caused by the release of some, let's say, vaguely genetic material from below, so to speak. So yeah, during the earthquake, I mean. So in section 5, some additional evidence has been provided, as well as a lot of really freaky ideas like that, which kind of follow from this initial hypothesis, at least part 1 of it, that there is an ultra-deep biosphere, which was, by the way, I know I'm gonna get a comment like that, that it was already proposed by Thomas Gold in his paper, Deep Hot Biosphere. There was actually a book about that in 1989 or 1990, something like that. But there was a paper even preceding the book where he proposed that, yeah, microorganisms may exist much deeper than we thought. But what is different with this paper from Thomas Gold's thinking is that it adds another layer, which is maybe those, actually multiple layers if you think about it, but the most important layer is that maybe this ultra-deep biosphere, hypothetical so far, can be responsible for earthquake production, or at least can be partly involved in it. So this is the main idea of the paper, really. Although, again, as I've said, there's like 1,000 of other ideas, so I highly recommend you to read it. Like, I wouldn't be able to cover even the half of it, or even fourth of what is talked about in the paper. All right, so yeah, so in section 5, some additional tools that microorganisms may utilize for survival are examined. I of course could have made this video in sort of a smarter way. Maybe I could have included the like screen share of me like discussing various paragraphs, etc. But we're doing things cheap here, This is Eugene the Philosopher. This is not some super cool YouTube channel. And as you might have noticed, I never do any cuts in my videos. This was my policy from day one. So you get what you paid for, which is nothing basically, right? Okay, so then the author says that so I'll just list some of the tools that I've mentioned that microorganisms might utilize for survival, and those are the formation of exoskeleton or biofilms, symbiosis, dormancy, phase transitions of various elements, including carbon and silicon, maybe thermoregulation through radiative emission, something we don't observe on the surface of Earth, except maybe different coloring of plants, but I don't really know. But under the ground, this might be an important factor, but whatever. Maybe I'll comment on that afterwards. So the author proposes an alternative scenario for the formation of hydrocarbon deposits, as already mentioned, in particular by these microorganisms alone. So there's this controversy currently that has been running for, again, maybe half a century or actually much longer. But anyway, Thomas Gold, by the way, was one of the proponents of abiogenic hydrocarbon production. This hypothesis implies actually some sort of a third branch. So there's one idea that hydrocarbons are biogenic in origin, but this bio from which it is genic is very old. So you need millions of years to compress all these proverbial dinosaurs into oil, right? It's actually not dinosaurs, but anyway, or coal or gas or whatever. So this is one idea, which is currently the mainstream. Then there's another idea that, oh no, it's actually abiogenic, so you don't need to compress dinosaurs for millions of years. Maybe the Earth itself, like the inorganic matter itself, somehow produces this organic matter, well, hydrocarbons in this case. Well, really, when you say organic matter, you mean something that contains carbon, in chemistry at least. But there's this third branch which follows from this paper, which is that it might be hydrocarbons may be biogenic in origin, but they are produced not by compressing dinosaurs, but sort of in situ by the microorganisms that are there always, sort of. This kind of idea. So it's definitely some sort of synthesis of the two, I guess, but at the same time it's sort of an independent idea in the first place. So the author proposes a revised maximal depth of the existence of microorganisms on Earth of at least 75 kilometers. So currently it is assumed that deeper than 10 kilometers below the surface nothing can stay alive. But the author says, well, at least 75, not 10. But maybe even more, but at least 75, right? And another interesting thing is that the paper talks about the possible role of microorganisms in the atmosphere and subsurface in terms of driving the weather and climate. And I think I'll stop on this question a little bit later. I'll just kind of skim the whole paper probably after reading the conclusions and just comment on various disconnected issues. All right, so weather and climate. Can biosphere be somehow responsible for that? Well, we'll try to figure it out. There are a couple of interesting ideas here, definitely. So, as well as the author says that they imply that the role of microorganisms in the global electric circuit of Earth is underestimated, or actually it is ignored. But maybe we need to turn our attention to that. Maybe it is important, all right? Then the possibility of extraterrestrial life in producing seismicity on other celestial bodies is explored. You probably heard about moonquakes. Then there has been a piece of news recently about Mars quakes detected by this InSight lander, etc. So it might be the case that these are also related to some sort of biosphere on the corresponding celestial bodies. So, and then the possible evolutionary role of this ultra-deep biosphere, hypothetical one, is discussed, and potential evolutionary significance of biogenic earthquake production, as it seems to enhance gene transfer processes. Now, there has been experiments that has shown that like the seismic-like shaking induces what is called the horizontal gene transfer. So roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, like two species, or I don't know how you call them, two organisms kind of rub against each other and they sort of exchange genetic material directly. So they become some other species eventually, or at least they mutate through this process, right? Although no one really understands how it proceeds. Maybe it's actually not the, sort of rubbing, this tribo effect, but maybe it's, again, some sort of current that is associated with this shaking, which is doing this thing, or electric fields or magnetic fields. No one really knows. But the experiments clearly show, in laboratory experiments, clearly show that, such a thing takes place. Right? And then one interesting idea that is given is that this electroautotrophy, or autotrophy, which means basically feeding on electricity, right? We have just photoautotrophy, which means feeding on photons, on light from the sun. I mean, the plants do that all the time, or cyanobacteria, plankton, you name it. But we may also have, or we actually do have, electroautotrophy when organisms may grow purely feeding on electric currents, and it has been shown that like probably over 100 of such organisms already are known, maybe even more, I'm not sure. So the idea that is given in the paper is that, well, we have one set of organisms that feed. Okay, so we have, what sources of energy do we have from outside the Earth, let's say? This is first and foremost the solar radiation. But secondly, we have charged particles and electromagnetic fields from outer space, from the sun and other bodies, like if we're talking about cosmic rays, for example. So the idea is, if life adopted so well to consuming the solar radiation, so much so that the plants, these autotrophs, are in terms of biomass, like the largest biome on Earth, it's like 70% or about so, or of all the biomass on Earth is all those photoautotrophs. So why wouldn't life adapt to consume this other source of energy, which is charged particles and electromagnetic fields? So yeah, why not? So, and it is proposed that this hypothetical subsurface biosphere, since it doesn't have access to solar radiation, photons, the light, it still have access to currents that are induced in Earth's crust and mantle and whatnot by these cosmic influences, whatever they are, either cosmic rays or the solar particles or whatever, maybe gamma ray bursts, who knows? Like, in some distant places in the galaxy or even farther. So, yeah. Then some weirder hypotheses are given that, there may exist, again, this network, subterranean network of life under the surface, etc., connecting the remote areas of the planet. Because, well, you may have heard that there is a correlation, like temporal correlation. It has been found recently in one of the papers report on that. Correlation between earthquakes in different parts of the world. So maybe it is, let's say, this correlation is actually caused by this underground connectivity of whatever we're talking about, this biosphere, hypothetical one, right? And again, some geological implications are discussed. So, okay, then we have like, how many, 7, 8, I don't know, pages of references, like maybe a couple of hundred of them. So let's just, I'll try to wrap this up right now, but I'll just run through the paper itself and see if there's something to mention aside from what I've already talked about. So let me just give me just a couple of minutes. So yeah, like one of the motivational sort of steps into this idea was the realization, I guess, that the tectonic activity, again, the paper is called Possible Tectonic Impact of Biosphere, which is sort of like a pun, you know, because, well, tectonic in the sense that huge, and at the same time literally tectonic. So the tectonic activity, the like tectonic plates, are assumed currently to exist only on Earth, and at the same time earthquakes only exist on Earth. And I don't mean in the sense that, well, earthquakes obviously exist on Earth. On Mars it would be Marsquakes, but so far it hasn't been confirmed that the shaking of the ground on other planets is caused by the same factors as on Earth. So this is sort of a far-fetched idea of how do you arrive at the idea that maybe the existence of life, which so far is confirmed to exist only on Earth, may correlate to tectonic activity. So this is basically the main idea in the introduction. And so the idea is to reverse this, how do you say it, causality, and to say that tectonic activity and earthquake activity is actually driven by life, because there is some evidence that actually tectonic activity did not exist on Earth before Archean eon, which is the time when life appeared. So maybe actually life, the appearance of life, produced tectonic / seismic activity on Earth in the first place. So this is the idea. All right. And so what follows from this idea is this biogenic earthquake hypothesis that biology, biosphere, may play a significant role, or at least some role, in the production of earthquakes, and perhaps even in the motion of plate tectonics. Who knows if such a thing exists? Again, I'm very skeptical about the models of Earth, but who knows, basically. That's the conclusion, basically, from the introduction, right? Then the introduction again lists what we can see in different sections. So in section 2, various variations of this hypothesis are proposed. So the hypothesis itself might be formulated really briefly in such a way: living organisms play an active role in the earthquake phenomena. That's it. So, and again, two questions are asked. Are they a certain source of energy, or are they a source of, or are they a trigger, those living organisms? And 4 possible scenarios might be drawn from this, like yes, 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 no, no, yes, no, no, right? And even if you say no, no, so they're neither a source of energy nor the trigger, it still leaves the possibility for them to play some role. Maybe they provide some energy. Maybe they provide something else, some maybe chemicals. Or, I don't know, like whatever, for earthquake production. So they are part of the equation, so to speak, right? Then in section 2.2, some energy estimates are given. So the largest known earthquake recorded by instruments of 1960 in Chile had a certain amount of energy radiated, and some simple calculation is given. And by the way, this earthquake alone accounts for 30% of all the seismic energy released in 20th century. So that's quite a lot, you know. That's 1/3 of the whole century's worth of earthquakes, right? And it has been shown that in 1 second, the known amount of biomass in sub-oceanic sediments alone can produce such energy, just in 1 second. So yeah, so basically the conclusion that is made from this is that it is very possible for life to generate such an energy if it would have tools to somehow focus it in a single point and, well, somehow initiate the earthquake or whatever. So it doesn't exclude this initial, this preliminary analysis doesn't exclude the option why on the first, the answer why on the first question. Yes, I mean, so definitely biosphere may be a source of energy for earthquakes. All right. So in section 3, some detailed analysis is given. Speaking about corona. So it says that, well, what can we fish out from here? Well, let's see. Yeah, well, it says that the only option is in situ energy production if we don't appeal to the force, you know, something like that, which I prefer not to do. So basically it says that, well, it means that biological organisms need to be present right there where the earthquakes are happening. So and it seems that it seems to reasonable. It seems that it says that it seems to be reasonable to assume that most likely these organisms are microorganisms. But what exact type of organism they are is not clear. Maybe they're some unknown type of organism. But out of known type of organisms, we may say, well, they might be archaea or bacteria or protozoa or algae or yeast or fungi or other types of organisms, you know, some sort of stuff like that. And there are obviously some limitations like hostile environmental conditions, lack of nutrients, lack of energy sources. And the next sections kind of try to deal with that. So again, 3.2 discusses how we underestimated seriously the possibilities of life to adapt, and there are many, many examples. Like one of the most fascinating example was reported about in 2018, where they've shown that certain bacteria can survive 420 degrees Celsius, which is considered absolutely impossible previously. But they can, apparently. So the previous limit for life was about 121, I think. I might actually be mistaken. It's been quite a while since I've read the paper. Well, I don't know. So yeah, so roughly 3 to 4 times more. I mean, it's proven that life can withstand 3 to 4 times higher temperatures than has been assumed even 2 years ago, even 3 years ago. So you see, it's quite an astonishing figure, I would say. Then the author estimates that according to some models, again, models of the Earth suck, like, to be honest. Like, we have zero understanding of what happens beneath our feet. And like, it's all model dependent. It's all based on unproven and unprovable hypotheses at the moment, at least. So yeah, again, you can argue that the Earth is hollow easily, like see Jan Lamprecht's research, who has shown that seismic signals can propagate the way they do if the density of Earth, after some boundary layer, let's say, starts dropping, so it would produce the same sort of refraction pattern, and there's a hollow cavity instead of a solid core inside. Because if you think about it, like, what modern geophysics assumes, let's say, mantle to be? Well, first of all, it should be liquid in order to contain or sustain the convective motions, because it is assumed that these mantle convective motions drive plate tectonics. But at the same time, so it should be liquid, right? But at the same time, mantle should be solid for it to transmit S waves, shear waves. So it should be liquid and solid simultaneously. And excuse me, but this is bullshit. Like, really, guys, come on. I mean, seriously. So yeah, so this is my point, that we don't know, we have zero understanding of what happens beneath our feet currently. And so some models, and by the way, I wish to remember this idea that I've already mentioned, I think, in my video about nonlinearities in time. I don't remember. This idea that there is a special, well, there are certain types of meta objects or whatever. So there is an object, there is a system, there is a medium, but there's also a sphere. So sphere is not an object, it's not a medium, and it's not a system. It's something completely different. And I gave examples of Earth and Sun in particular. It's not my idea, but anyway. So the sphere, one of its key properties in philosophical sense is that it's impenetrable. You cannot know what's inside of it, right? Which is the case for Earth and Sun in particular. So yeah, I wish to repeat this idea here. So yeah, it's basically, some models say that even liquid water can exist at 75 kilometers, which is a nice coincidence with this estimate that the author gives for life to exist if it can sustain 400 and how much, 20 Celsius. So life easily, according to current research, at least some of it, can exist at such depths. And well, you might say, well, there's a huge pressures around 3 gigapascals, again, according to some models. But life can sustain hundreds of gigapascals, as some research says. So it's not a problem at all. And it's, mind you, it's life that we know, it's species that we have studied, but who knows what kind of species can exist there. It's completely unknown yet. Alright, then 3.3 discusses possible nutrient sources. And again, well, I wouldn't stop on this. I wish to already finish this, but there's like, I don't know, 15 pages. So what's interesting about this is the idea that, okay, so nutrients are abundant in the mantle. I mean, I've already mentioned that all kinds of minerals are present there, all kinds of elements can be recycled from the very rock itself. And with regards to energy, I've already mentioned when I was reading the conclusions that we have this process of, roughly speaking, eating electricity, right? So these organisms, and there has been plenty of research recently on those species. Like, you can literally grow bacteria on your electrodes, right? So, yeah, so this process is proposed to be of high importance for this subsurface biosphere because it doesn't have access to solar light, so it has to utilize something else. It doesn't really have access to, let's say, oxygen, although there's plenty of oxygen in the minerals, but it's not in the open, for, how do you say it, free form, so they have to do something else. So they can breathe rock, literally, by, well, what is breathing? It's essentially transporting electrons from something to the oxygen, right? But you can, so the energy is taken from this transport of electrons, but you can do the same thing by transporting electrons from something to something which is not oxygen, right? So this is also breathing, technically. Yeah, and then it would, so maybe these telluric currents play a role in the acquisition of energy by these organisms. So this is basically the idea, all right? And so maybe these organisms themselves might produce telluric currents. So this is kind of a vague, unclear area so far, like whether telluric currents feed these organisms, or organisms produce telluric currents through their feeding, or it works kind of both ways in a loop, or I don't know. Nobody knows, to be honest, at this moment. Of course, nobody knows that this, nobody is sure that these organisms exist in the first place, right? So yeah, this is probably all I'm going to say about that. So in secondary evidence in section 4, We're talking about the methane emissions, which I've already mentioned. Like, there's plenty of evidence of emission of methane during, after, and even before the earthquakes, and from fault lines in general, etc., etc. So yeah, so maybe this methane is biogenic. This is basically the idea. And one important thing is that you cannot really distinguish biogenic methane from abiogenic, as is currently done, wrongly, I would add, because it has been shown, again, I have references here in the paper, that isotopic compositions may change depending on the environment that this organism is in. So the organism might actually change somehow isotopic composition of methane. I mean, C and H, probably only C, I'm not sure. Right, so then induced earthquakes, this fracking stuff. So yeah, it has been known that oil extracted from fracking wells is highly corrosive due to a lot of bacteria in it. So there's no doubt that in this oil there's a lot of life in it, right? So the question is, can this life actually produce earthquakes induced by the fracking process? And I've already mentioned the idea that maybe the injection of salt water actually enhances the activity of this biosphere somehow, either by enhancing the telluric currents, because obviously it enhances conductivity, etc., or by just supplying them with water, right? So yeah. Then volcanic eruptions, I've already talked about that many volcanic eruptions demonstrate curious populations of microbes afterwards, etc. Then the post-earthquake infections, and by the way, speaking about the corona, I've tried today to find any related quakes to that, and I didn't find. There was a quake almost literally in Wuhan, China, where supposedly corona comes from, but the quake was on December 26th, I think, whereas it is assumed that the corona appeared like in the beginning of December, some say in late October, but definitely not on December 26th, so it doesn't actually count. But anyway, 5.0 magnitude, by the way, earthquake I'm talking about, not a very strong one, and there were like literally hundreds of similar quakes all around the globe, so the question might be, well, why wouldn't it appear anywhere else? But anyway, so there's plenty of cases when earthquake induces infections in a lot of places, and what's interesting is that guidelines previously on treating earthquake infections targeted gram-positive bacteria, whereas later it was recognized, literally like 10 years ago only, that actually after earthquakes, mysteriously only gram-negative infections appear, or at least like in most cases. So maybe it has something to do with the way this subterranean biosphere works, the hypothetical one, I mean. Maybe, but nobody really knows. And what's interesting is that gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria react differently to plasma-induced deactivation, which is quite a novel field of disinfection today. Right? Okay. So in section 5, there's just plenty of various ideas, like additional tools for survival. Again, we've talked about exoskeletons, we've talked about the symbiosis, like forming something of like a hamburger, you know, of different species, just symbiotically helping each other to solve these various problems they encounter there, like nutrient deficiency, extreme conditions, etc., etc. And there are plenty of other tools. I've already listed them when I was reading the conclusions, and like there's quite a lot to be interested in this paper, so I recommend you to read it for yourself. One interesting thing I will mention is, again, this radiative cooling, which isn't present on Earth really, where you might have an extremely black microorganism, theoretically, under the surface, which would emit so much, just in photons, that it would cool rapidly, because emission depends on temperature in the fourth power. So the hotter it becomes, the more like explosively more it's going to emit. So this is one possibility. And we know that carbon can form these materials, like again, Vanta black, this famous blackest of black materials, although recently even a blacker material was discovered, etc. So read the paper if you're interested. So this might be additional evolutionary tool for basically sustaining themselves, these microorganisms, I mean, hypothetical ones. Then again, this origin of hydrocarbons is discussed, but I've already talked about that. Then the deep focus earthquakes are discussed, but I wouldn't stop on that. There's quite a lot to talk about, and I don't really have the time. Just read the paper if you're interested. And then what I'm certainly going to talk about is the global electric circuit. It's sort of an off topic for this paper, but what the author notes is that, well, basically, just point by point without much comment. So, firstly, it has been shown that bacteria, microorganisms in general, play a huge role in evaporation from oceans. That's a huge way of impacting the climate and electric circuit. Then, microorganisms are present in the stratosphere and even higher than that, even on the surface of International Space Station. Then microorganisms are shown to be able to induce cloud nucleation. They can produce snow and rain. And this is the important thing I wanted to talk about really briefly, because I don't have much time. But currently, again, people say about, well, what kind of role do cosmic ray particles play in climate modulation? Let's say by producing cloud nucleation nuclei, ice nucleation nuclei, by producing clouds essentially. But what is overlooked, I would state, is the role of biosphere in this same process, because again, it has been shown that microorganisms can produce snow just on their own. And even the industrial snow, like for ski resorts, etc., is produced by bacteria, believe it or not. This Pseudomonas syringae. Again, read the paper if you want more details. But I wish to emphasize this idea that the role of biosphere in climate change, and I don't mean biosphere as people, you know, anthropogenic climate change. I mean the biosphere that's beside people, is seriously underestimated. That would be my point, right? Not only this atmospheric biosphere, but even subsurface biosphere, which might regulate these longer cycles because it actually has a much slower metabolism of the order of thousands of years, by the way. And we have ice ages of like tens of thousands of years, so who knows? Maybe it's actually the subsurface that's governing those cycles and not the orbital variations or whatever the heck we can talk about. All right, so this is the idea I wish to underline with respect to this thing. Then there is an idea about the extraterrestrial life, like can life actually produce seismic signals on other planets? And the short answer is probably yes. So life actually can traverse these cosmic currents, according to the author of the paper at least, because if the cell acquires a charge of, let's say, 1,000 electrons, or maybe 10,000s or 100,000s, which isn't a lot, to be honest, in macroscopic sense at least, it can just travel all the magnetospheres and the interplanetary magnetic field. It can go to other stars easily, and it can go into this dormant mode, turn into a spore, so not be quite alive, but be able to become alive. And it can survive for millions or hundreds of millions of years. And it has been shown that bacteria can survive those time intervals. They can just turn into spores and just lie dormant for hundreds of millions of years. Or at least supposedly, if we believe our dating methods, etc. Which I don't, by the way, but, well, who knows? So yeah, certainly life from Earth can exist on the Moon, on Mars, and at the same time life from the Moon and Mars can exist on Earth. So yeah, there you go. Okay, think I've missed something. Yeah, and there's an important, I believe, evolutionary role. I've already mentioned how the, well, let's say earthquakes can produce horizontal genetic transfer. So earthquakes may actually be a tool for the subsurface biosphere to evolve. It may be a sort of a mating game, you know, when these bacteria decide that they need a next generation, so to speak, with different genes, so they produce an earthquake. But who knows? But at the same time, after a mass extinction, this subsurface biosphere might provide additional genes to the surface biosphere, right? And this is the idea. Okay, and probably the concluding remarks. Well, I wouldn't really stop on this. There's really a lot to talk about. Like, believe me, like, you can see how many pages I've already turned. So, yeah, I'll probably finish somewhere here. What the hell is this? Okay, those are already conclusions. Maybe some exotic life forms are possible, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, there's really a lot to talk about. But essentially, like on the surface, so to speak, no pun intended, or maybe it is, of this paper, there is an idea that subsurface organisms, hypothetical ones, mind you, may be responsible in that way or another for the production of earthquakes. And then this idea that they may be responsible for that is explored in many details, and at the same time, a lot of hypothetical implications of this hypothesis are explored also, like the role in climate, in all the secondary observations like emissions of methane, hydrocarbon production, climate and weather, longer climatic cycles, evolution, extraterrestrial life, telluric currents. All of that is explored in a lot of detail. Like, believe me, there's a lot to talk about there. So if you're interested, please read the paper. Hopefully you would like it. Yeah, I've already mentioned that. I don't quite remember if I mentioned that I will put links into the description to the 4 videos I've already mentioned about this paper, but this video is another possibility for you to become aware of such a hypothesis if you haven't been aware of it previously. So, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.